अब मैं नहीं रह सकती तुम लोगों के साथ। तुम लोगों को परेशान हूँ दोनों से, दोनों ही मतलब मेरे से भी जिम्मेदार।
I'm not gonna live with someone yelling at me all the time just because they're not getting what they want. I'm hitting a breaking point here. I'm just done.
For years, the story looked simple. A love story against the odds. An older American woman and a younger Indian man choosing each other while the entire world told them not to. Viewers watched them argue with family, fight cultural pressure, and defend their relationship season after season. It was easy to frame them as rebels, two people standing up for love. But something about the situation today feels very different. Because if you look at where things stand now, the fairy tale version starts to crack. The same relationship that once looked like courage now raises a much darker question that fans have been debating quietly for a while. What if this isn't a love story anymore? What if it's a trap neither of them knows how to escape? Right now, the reality around Jenny Slatten and Sumit Singh looks far from the romantic struggle viewers were originally sold. Sumit is unemployed. Financial pressure is constant, and the couple's living situation has become increasingly dependent on his family. The same parents he once fought so hard to defy are now part of his everyday reality again. That alone already changes the tone of the story. But there is another pressure hanging quietly over everything, and it's one that rarely gets discussed directly. Jenny's ability to leave India at any moment creates a power imbalance that didn't exist when the relationship first began. On paper, it sounds simple. If things become too difficult, she can return to the United States. But in practice, that possibility changes the entire dynamic. Because if she leaves, what happens to Sumit? He already made choices that permanently reshaped his life. His family relationship fractured for years. His arranged marriage ended in a very public and humiliating way. His reputation inside his community took a serious hit. Those decisions can't be undone. And suddenly the story starts to look less like two people fighting together and more like one person who already burned every bridge behind him. That shift in perspective is exactly why so many viewers have started looking back at earlier seasons with new eyes. Years ago, Sumit's parents were portrayed as the obvious villains. They were loud, they were emotional, they fought aggressively to stop the relationship. At the time, it looked like cruel interference. But today, some fans are asking a question that didn't exist back then. What if they weren't just being controlling? What if they were seeing consequences that Sumit couldn't see yet? This is where psychology quietly enters the story. When people invest enormous amounts into a relationship, walking away becomes almost impossible. Not because the relationship works, but because leaving means admitting the sacrifice was pointless. Jenny sold belongings, cashed out retirement savings, and moved across the world. That's not a small step. That's an irreversible life decision. Sumit also made sacrifices that completely reshaped his future. He defied family expectations, ended a marriage, and attached his entire public identity to this relationship. Once both people reached that point, something powerful happened. Even if problems grow bigger, neither person wants to be the one who admits the entire story might have been built on a mistake. So the relationship continues, not necessarily because everything worked, but because the alternative feels even worse. And that brings us to the quiet mystery sitting underneath the entire situation today. Why do some fans believe the relationship now survives mainly because of television exposure? Why does the visa situation create such unusual leverage in their argument? And most importantly, did Sumit unknowingly trap himself in a life he no longer knows how to change? Those questions are uncomfortable. They challenge the simple narrative the show originally presented. But before visa pressure ever entered the picture, before the family war reached its worst moments, before financial stress and business failures complicated everything, there was one decision that quietly set this entire chain of events in motion. One moment where the stakes became real. The day Jenny left the United States, cashed out her retirement, and moved to India. Because once that happened, this relationship stopped being a romance. It became an investment that both of them now had to defend no matter what. To understand how the situation between Jenny and Sumit reached the point it has today, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not the romantic version that people like to remember. The real beginning. Because this relationship didn't start with two people meeting naturally and falling in love. It started with a lie. Years before the cameras ever showed up, Jenny met someone online who introduced himself as Michael Jones. The profile looked convincing. attractive photos, friendly messages, a story that sounded believable. For Jenny, it seemed like a normal connection forming across distance, except Michael Jones didn't exist. The photos belonged to someone else. The identity was fake. Behind the account was Sumit pretending to be another man. And this is the first uncomfortable moment in the story. Because when that deception finally came out, the logical expectation would be simple. Most people would walk away. Finding out that the person you trusted online built the relationship on a false identity usually ends things immediately. But that's not what happened here. Instead of cutting contact, Jenny continued talking to him. Eventually, the conversations grew stronger. The emotional connection didn't collapse under the weight of the lie. In a strange way, it survived it. At that point, something interesting started to form between them. The original deception didn't destroy the bond. It actually created a new dynamic where reality and fantasy blurred together. And this is where psychology begins to explain why the situation became so difficult to leave later. There's a behavioral pattern known as intermittent reinforcement. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. When affection and absence alternate unpredictably, the brain becomes more attached, not less. You chase the moments when things feel good. From what we saw over time, that pattern fits surprisingly well here. There were moments where Sumit was deeply affectionate and committed. Then there were long gaps, periods where he disappeared, explained by work or family obligations. Every time he came back, the emotional connection restarted, and that cycle quietly strengthened the relationship instead of weakening it. So when Jenny eventually decided to travel to India to meet him in person, the decision didn't feel reckless from her perspective. It felt like the natural next step in something she had already invested years into emotionally. The problem is that the deception wasn't over, because when Jenny arrived in India, another truth was waiting in the background that she didn't know yet. Something far more serious than a fake online identity. Sumit was already married, not in the past, not something resolved quietly years earlier. He was actively living a second life that Jenny knew nothing about. The timeline around this moment has always been one of the most debated parts of the entire story. When exactly did Jenny learn about the marriage? How long did it exist alongside their relationship? And why did the situation continue even after the truth began surfacing? Those questions still linger. Some viewers believe Jenny had absolutely no idea until the moment the reveal happened on television. Others believe the timeline might be more complicated than it appeared on screen. What's clear is that once the marriage was exposed, the relationship reached its most explosive turning point yet. The audience saw the aftermath play out in one of the most emotional scenes of the series. Jenny sitting in a hotel room, crying, trying to process the realization that the man she moved across the world for had been living a double life. At first glance, it looked like pure heartbreak. But the deeper consequences of that moment were still hidden, because the biggest impact of that revelation wasn't emotional, it was financial. Ending that marriage would require a divorce, and the cost of that decision would soon reshape the entire balance of power between Jenny and Sumit in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Once the secret marriage finally surfaced, the conflict moved beyond Jenny and Sumit. It spread outward and pulled the entire Singh family into the center of the storm. For years, many viewers believed one person stood directly in the way of the couple's happiness. Sumit's mother, Sadhna Singh. On screen, she was loud, emotional, and openly hostile toward the relationship. She argued with Jenny. She confronted her son. She made it clear that she did not accept the idea of him building a life with an American woman twice his age. At the time, the story felt simple. Jenny and Sumit were the couple fighting for love, and Sadhna represented the rigid tradition trying to crush it. But when you go back and examine the timeline carefully, that version of the story starts to look less certain, because Sadhna wasn't reacting to a normal relationship. She already knew something the audience didn't fully understand yet. Her son was married, not in the past, not in some distant chapter of his life. Married right then inside an arrangement the family had already committed to. From her perspective, the situation unfolding in front of her wasn't a romantic rebellion. It looked like a disaster forming in slow motion. A foreign relationship had entered the picture. Her son was lying to two women at the same time. And if the truth came out publicly, it would bring humiliation not just to him, but to the entire family. This is the moment where the cultural divide becomes impossible to ignore. For many Western viewers, love is treated as a private decision. Two people meet, they choose each other, and family opinion becomes secondary. Personal happiness usually takes priority. But inside Sumit's community, marriage operates differently. It connects families, reputation, and social standing. When a marriage collapses publicly, it doesn't just affect the couple, it ripples outward. And that's exactly what happened. When the truth became impossible to hide and Sumit finally moved toward divorce, the damage was immediate. The arranged marriage ended, but the consequences were severe. The process involved legal costs, financial settlements, and intense social fallout. That divorce didn't just close one chapter of Sumit's life, it opened a much heavier one. Because while viewers focused on the emotional drama, another reality quietly emerged behind the scenes. The money required to finalize that divorce had to come from somewhere, and much of that financial burden fell on the savings Jenny had brought with her. The retirement money she had sacrificed to start a new life in India suddenly became the lifeline holding the entire situation together. And with that, the relationship dynamic began shifting in ways neither of them had planned. Sumit lost something huge during that process. His marriage ended, his relationship with his parents fractured, and his position inside the family became unstable. Trust collapsed quickly once the deception and the divorce became public. At the same time, the financial pressure grew heavier. The couple who once framed themselves as romantic rebels now had to face practical reality. Bills, expectations, and the consequences of choices that could no longer be reversed. Inside the Singh household, the emotional damage was just as serious. Family members took sides. Arguments escalated. What had once been private conflict became a public fracture. And this is where the audience started splitting into different camps. Some viewers still believed Jenny and Sumit were victims of a controlling family structure. Others began reconsidering Sadhna's behavior entirely. Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, a difficult question emerges. Was she trying to destroy the relationship, or was she trying to stop a situation she believed would eventually collapse on its own? At the time, no one could fully answer that question. The relationship continued forward despite the warnings, despite the conflict, despite the financial strain. But years later, something unexpected happened. The conflict reached a point no one predicted. Jenny's savings began running out. Financial pressure grew heavier, stability became harder to maintain, and slowly the couple found themselves facing a reality that would have seemed impossible during their early battles for independence. The only place left for them to go was the home of the very woman who had fought the relationship from the beginning. By the time Jenny and Sumit ended up living under the same roof as his parents again, the relationship had already gone through years of stress. The romance that once fueled their decisions had been replaced by something more practical. They needed stability. They needed money. Most of all, they needed a way to prove that their life together could actually function. That's where the calf entered the picture. Opening a small family business looked like the perfect solution on paper. It gave Sumit a way to contribute financially. It allowed the family to rebuild some sense of unity after years of conflict. And it offered Jenny a chance to finally show that she could be part of everyday life in India, not just a guest in the household. For a moment, it looked like the reset button everyone needed. But the calf quickly became something else entirely. Instead of solving problems, it exposed them. Running a calf requires coordination. Orders come in quickly. Customers expect efficiency. Basic communication and simple financial transactions happen constantly throughout the day. In a busy environment like that, everyone involved has to contribute in some way. That's where things started to get uncomfortable. Viewers began noticing that Jenny struggled with tasks that the rest of the family handled easily. Something as simple as calculating change in rupees became a stressful moment. Taking orders from customers seemed overwhelming. Even small bursts of activity inside the calf appeared to create pressure she wasn't prepared for. Meanwhile, Sumit's parents stepped in repeatedly to keep things running. They handled customers, managed the kitchen, and organized most of the day-to-day work that kept the business alive. At first, some people defended Jenny. Starting a new job in a different country is intimidating. Currency systems are unfamiliar. Language barriers make simple interactions harder than they should be. Those explanations made sense up to a point. But as time passed, another interpretation started gaining traction among viewers. The problem might not have been ability. It might have been something else entirely. Psychologists often describe two similar behaviors that look identical on the surface but come from very different motivations. One is learned helplessness, where someone genuinely feels incapable of handling certain responsibilities after repeated struggles. The other is weaponized incompetence. That's when a person avoids learning necessary skills because someone else will eventually step in and handle the task for them. In the CAF environment, that question became impossible to ignore. Every time Jenny stepped away from a responsibility, someone else filled the gap, usually Sumit. And over time, a subtle shift in their relationship became clearer. Sumit wasn't just acting as a partner anymore. He was acting as a caretaker, a translator, a problem solver. He handled the situations Jenny avoided. The longer that pattern continued, the more pressure fell directly on him, which leads to another question people quietly started asking. If the CAF was meant to help the couple rebuild financially, why did the entire situation still feel so fragile? Because the business itself never became the solution everyone hoped it would be. Money was still tight. Family tension still lingered beneath the surface. And Sumit still struggled to establish any kind of independent career path outside of the show. That last detail mattered more than most people realize. Reality television exposure can create temporary income, but it rarely builds long-term stability. Without another source of income, the couple remained in a position where every financial setback felt dangerous, and slowly the atmosphere inside the relationship began changing again. Arguments started circling around the same themes: responsibility, effort, adaptation, the sense that one person was carrying more weight than the other. Then a new pressure entered the picture that made those conflicts even sharper: immigration. The possibility of leaving India had always existed in the background, but now it started appearing inside arguments more directly. Whenever frustration built up, a familiar sentence began resurfacing: if things don't change, I'll go back to America. On the surface, it sounded like exhaustion speaking. Anyone living under constant stress might say something similar, but in the context of everything Sumit had already sacrificed, that sentence carried enormous weight. Because if Jenny really did leave, the consequences wouldn't be temporary. They would follow Sumit for the rest of his life. By the time the CAF struggles and family tensions settled into daily life, another force had quietly become the most powerful factor in Jenny and Sumit's relationship. It wasn't money. It wasn't the family conflict anymore. It was the simple reality of geography. Jenny's ability to leave India at any time changed the balance of the entire relationship. On paper, it sounds like a normal option. Anyone living abroad should have the ability to return home if things become too difficult. But in this situation, that possibility carried far more weight than a normal travel decision. Because if Jenny left, the consequences for Sumit wouldn't just be emotional, they would be permanent. Over the years, he had already taken steps that reshaped his life in ways that couldn't be undone. His marriage ended in public controversy. His family relationships were pushed to the breaking point. His reputation within his community took a hit that would follow him long after television cameras moved on. Those were risks he accepted when he chose Jenny. But that decision only makes sense if the relationship lasts. If Jenny eventually walks away and returns to the United States, Sumit is left facing a very different reality. The sacrifices remain, but the relationship that justified them disappears. That possibility changes the entire psychological landscape between them. This is where the idea of dependency becomes impossible to ignore. Not the dramatic version people imagine when they hear the word. Something quieter and more complicated. Jenny relies on Sumit to navigate daily life in India. Language barriers, cultural differences, and social systems all become easier when he's there to translate and handle situations. But Sumit also relies on Jenny. She represents the relationship that defined his public identity. Their story brought attention, television exposure, and opportunities that didn't exist before. Without that connection, much of the structure supporting their current life collapses. So both people remain connected to something that is no longer just about love. It's about survival. Psychologists describe this pattern as codependency. Two people become locked into roles that reinforce each other even when the relationship itself becomes stressful or unstable. One person carries certain responsibilities. The other provides emotional validation or purpose. Over time, the cycle keeps repeating. Arguments happen. Frustration builds. But neither person walks away because leaving would require rebuilding an entirely new life. That cycle can last much longer than outsiders expect. Which brings us back to the central question that has followed this entire story from the beginning. Is Sumit trapped in the relationship he fought so hard to create? The answer isn't as simple as people want it to be. Yes, there are moments where the power balance appears uneven. When the possibility of Jenny leaving becomes part of an argument, the pressure on Sumit becomes obvious. He has far more to lose if the relationship ends. But the deeper truth may be something more complicated than a victim and a villain. Jenny also committed her life to this decision. She left behind her country, her home, and the stability she once had. Living in India permanently wasn't a temporary adventure for her. It became the center of her life. Walking away now would mean admitting that the entire journey led nowhere. And most people resist that realization as long as they possibly can. So instead of a clear winner and loser, what we might actually be looking at is two people caught inside the same structure they built together. A relationship that began with excitement and defiance slowly turning into something heavier. Not because either person planned it that way, but because every decision pushed them further down a path that became harder and harder to leave. That's why the story of Jenny and Sumit doesn't really fit the simple categories people try to assign to it. It isn't just about a controlling family or a stubborn couple refusing to listen to warnings. It's about what happens when a relationship begins with fantasy and eventually has to face ordinary reality. And reality rarely follows the script people imagined when the story first started, which leaves one final question hanging over everything we've seen. The future of this relationship might not depend on another argument, another family conflict, or another financial struggle. The real test could come much later, the day the cameras finally disappear. Because if the attention, the storyline, and the outside pressure fade away, the only thing left will be the relationship itself. And that's when we may finally see whether this story was ever strong enough to survive on its own.